Close your eyes and imagine a world before the noise where the only light came from a flickering candle and the swirling ancient stars above. Tonight, we aren't just sleeping. We are traveling into the vivid, pained, and brilliant mind of Vincent van Gogh, the Dutch painter whose life became a masterpiece of misunderstood genius. In the next few minutes, the boundaries of time will slowly dissolve. You don't need to remember dates or memorize names. Instead, I want you to feel the texture of thick oil paint on a canvas and hear the wind whispering through a Dutch wheat field. We are moving toward a sanctuary of color, born from a heart that felt everything too deeply, a story where brilliance clashes with shadows, and beauty is born from the very center of suffering. His legacy still stirs the deepest parts of our souls, quietly challenging every idea we have ever held about the meaning of success or failure. If you find peace in this journey, your presence here is the only reward we seek. Take this moment to let go of the day behind you, finding a position of total, heavy comfort as the outside world fades into a soft, distant blur. Everything is quiet now. Everything is safe. Dim the lights. Turn on a fan for that soothing hum, and let us dive into the world of Vincent together. Imagine, if you will, a small, quiet village nestled deep in the southern reaches of the Netherlands, a place called Zundert. In the mid-19th century, life here moved with the steady, predictable rhythm of the changing seasons and the soft, distant tolling of the local church bell across the damp fields. It was in this peaceful, structured place, on a cool March morning in 1853, that a boy was born into a family defined by a modest, serious faith. His father was a dedicated minister, a man of firm rules, while his mother carried a silent, unspoken passion for the wild beauty of the natural world and the gentle art of drawing. But the boy's arrival carried a haunting, silent weight that few children could ever truly fathom. He was the eldest of 6 siblings, yet he grew up in a house where a particular shadow always lingered. Just outside the heavy doors of the local church, a cold stone bore his own name and his own birth date, exactly 1 year apart. It was the grave of his older brother, a stillborn child who had come into the world precisely 1 year before him. One can only wonder what that does to a young, sensitive mind to see your own name carved into the earth before you have even learned to speak. He became a guest in his own existence, a serious and withdrawn soul who found more comfort in the company of the wind than in the voices of people. Nature began to speak to him in a secret language, whispering through the trees, in a way that the rest of the world had long since forgotten how to hear. As a young boy, Vincent lived on the very edges of his own life, a silent, watchful observer waiting for a purpose he could not yet name. He was often described by those around him as intense, a withdrawn child who struggled to find his footing or connect with the rigid expectations of his teachers and classmates. There was a visible restlessness deep within him, a feeling of being slightly out of sync with the world's frantic pace. While others saw only a difficult child, Vincent was busy absorbing the world with an intimacy that few others dared to attempt. He wasn't holding a paintbrush yet, and the masterpieces that would one day change the course of human history were still many years away. But the seeds of his unique vision were already taking deep, quiet root in his imagination. He possessed a growing, quiet obsession with the hidden beauty found in the most ordinary moments, the curve of a tilled field, the rough texture of an old tree, or the way the evening light catches a passing cloud. He lingered where everyone else hurried by, collecting the tiny, precious details that the rest of the world ignored in its rush. You are safe now to linger here with him, letting your own thoughts drift like those distant, silent clouds. He was walking a lonely road through the gray mist of uncertainty, but even then, deep within that silence, a life of brilliant, vibrant color was waiting just ahead to be discovered. As Vincent reached his late teens and stepped into the long, uncertain shadows of his early 20s, the world began to demand a certain direction from him. A career, a social purpose, a clear and steady path forward into the adult world. Yet, his journey refused to follow a straight or easy line. Instead, it stalled, doubled back, and twisted through the landscapes of Europe as he tried, with a heavy heart, to fit into the rigid molds society offered him. His uncle helped him secure a position at a successful art firm, taking him from the quiet, rain-washed streets of The Hague to the bustling, unfamiliar energy of London, and later to Paris. He was surrounded by famous galleries, wealthy collectors, and the high-end business of art. But for Vincent, this world of buying and selling felt cold, mechanical, and entirely devoid of the deep, trembling emotion he craved. His interest in the trade faded like old ink. His mood grew increasingly withdrawn, and the firm eventually let him go into the silence. In the foggy, rain-slicked streets of London, he experienced a sharp and stinging heartbreak when a woman rejected his earnest love, a pain that cut much deeper than any career failure ever could. This rejection, combined with his growing distaste for the commercial art world, triggered a new and intense phase in his life, one defined by an overwhelming spiritual yearning to find a sanctuary for his soul. He turned toward religion with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, hoping to serve something much greater than his own lonely self. He trained briefly to follow in his father's footsteps as a minister, but he struggled with the stiff, formal structures of the church and ultimately failed his formal theology exam. Yet, he did not stop searching for a way to quiet the restless, hungry spirit inside him. He began to seek a more visceral way to process the world's quiet suffering, a path that would eventually lead him far away from the comforts of home and into the deep, echoing shadows of a place where few chose to go. Vincent eventually found himself wandering into the Borinage, a bleak and desolate coal mining region in Belgium, where the gray sky was perpetually stained by thick soot and the very earth felt heavy with the ancient weight of labor. There, among the starving families and the weary workers who emerged from the black pits covered in layers of dark dust, Vincent attempted to live as a missionary in the truest, most radical sense of the word. He gave away his meager possessions, slept on cold, bare floors, and fully embraced a life of absolute poverty to mirror the suffering of the humble people he hoped to serve with his whole heart. However, the established church viewed his total selfless devotion as a dangerous form of fanaticism and quickly dismissed him from his post, closing yet another heavy door on his desperate search for a sense of belonging. But in the thick, heavy silence of that rejection, something unexpected and profoundly beautiful began to stir within him like a seed in the dark. Amidst the pervasive gloom of the mines and the smell of coal dust, he reached for a simple pencil and began to sketch the laborers, the miners, and the hollow-cheeked people of the village. He did not draw with any polished technique or academic grace. Instead, he drew with an raw, overwhelming empathy that came from seeing his own deep loneliness reflected in their tired, weathered faces. His pencil became a secret language, a way to translate the crushing weight of human suffering into something that could finally be seen, touched, and understood by others. By the age of 27, after years of restlessness, failure, and endless wandering, Vincent made a quiet, definitive decision to dedicate the rest of his life to art. It was not a choice born of ambition or the desire for fame, as he had no illusions of success in this world. It was a desperate, final act of survival. He had finally found a direction that promised to turn his inner chaos into something that others might one day recognize as beautiful. As Vincent reached his late teens and stepped into the long, uncertain shadows of his early 20s, the world began to demand a certain direction from him. A career, a social purpose, a clear and steady path forward into the adult world. Yet, his journey refused to follow a straight or easy line. Instead, it stalled, doubled back, and twisted through the landscapes of Europe as he tried, with a heavy heart, to fit into the rigid mold society offered him. His uncle helped him secure a position at a successful art firm, taking him from the quiet, rain-washed streets of The Hague to the bustling, unfamiliar energy of London, and later to Paris. He was surrounded by famous galleries, wealthy collectors, and the high-end business of art. But for Vincent, this world of buying and selling felt cold, mechanical, and entirely devoid of the deep, trembling emotion he craved. His interest in the trade faded like old ink. His mood grew increasingly withdrawn, and the firm eventually let him go into the silence. In the foggy, rain-slicked streets of London, he experienced a sharp and stinging heartbreak when a woman rejected his earnest love, a pain that cut much deeper than any career failure ever could. This rejection, combined with his growing distaste for the commercial art world, triggered a new and intense phase in his life, one defined by an overwhelming spiritual yearning to find a sanctuary for his soul. He turned toward religion with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, hoping to serve something much greater than his own lonely self. He trained briefly to follow in his father's footsteps as a minister, but he struggled with the stiff formal structures of the church and ultimately failed his formal theology exams. Yet, he did not stop searching for a way to quiet the restless, hungry spirit inside him. He began to seek a more visceral way to process the world's quiet suffering, a path that would eventually lead him far away from the comforts of home and into the deep, echoing shadows of a place where few chose to go. Vincent eventually found himself wandering into the Borinage, a bleak and desolate coal mining region in Belgium, where the grey sky was perpetually stained by thick soot, and the very earth felt heavy with the ancient weight of labor. There, among the starving families and the weary workers who emerged from the black pits, covered in layers of dark dust, Vincent attempted to live as a missionary in the truest, most radical sense of the word. He gave away his meager possessions, slept on cold, bare floors, and fully embraced a life of absolute poverty to mirror the suffering of the humble people he hoped to serve with his whole heart. However, the established church viewed his total, selfless devotion as a dangerous form of fanaticism and quickly dismissed him from his post, closing yet another heavy door on his desperate search for a sense of belonging. But in the thick, heavy silence of that rejection, something unexpected and profoundly beautiful began to stir within him like a seed in the dark. Amidst the pervasive gloom of the mines and the smell of coal dust, he reached for a simple pencil and began to sketch the laborers, the miners, and the hollow-cheeked people of the village. He did not draw with any polished technique or academic grace. Instead, he drew with a raw, overwhelming empathy that came from seeing his own deep loneliness reflected in their tired, weathered faces. His pencil became a secret language, a way to translate the crushing weight of human suffering into something that could finally be seen, touched, and understood by others. By the age of 27, after years of restlessness, failure, and endless wandering, Vincent made a quiet, definitive decision to dedicate the rest of his life to art. It was not a choice born of ambition or the desire for fame, as he had no illusions of success in this world. It was a desperate, final act of survival. He had finally found a direction that promised to turn his inner chaos into something that others might one day recognize as beautiful. Vincent's decision to become an artist was not met with the sound of applause or a sudden, magical mastery of the craft. It was instead the beginning of a relentless and often deeply uncomfortable effort of the soul. Lacking any formal training or academic pedigree, he threw himself into his new labor with a terrifying, obsessive intensity that rarely wavered, even in the dead of night. He spent his long days and flickering nights studying the curves of anatomy, mastering the difficult laws of perspective, and copying the sketches of old masters to build a foundation from the cold ground up. Art was no longer just a hobby for him. It had become a physical and spiritual necessity for his very breath, supported only by the quiet, faithful financial help of his younger brother, Theo, who believed in him when no one else would. His earliest works were not meant to charm the eyes or delight the viewer with easy beauty. They were dark, heavy, and somber canvases, dominated by deep, earth-toned browns, grays, and blacks that seemed to hold the weight of the soil itself. He was drawn to the ordinary, the weathered, and the forgotten faces of the working class, the peasants laboring in the fields and the tired laborers hunched over their small fires. In these dark, moody paintings, he sought to tell a fundamental, unvarnished truth about the human condition, believing that an honest painting was infinitely more valuable than a merely beautiful. He famously painted the potato eaters, capturing a family gathered around a simple table, their rough, calloused hands and somber expressions telling a quiet story of exhaustion and resilient dignity. He once wrote that he wanted his art to touch people so deeply that they would say, "He feels tenderly," and every heavy, deliberate stroke of his brush was a silent testament to that desire. Even as his physical health began to decline from a lack of food and proper rest, his artistic voice was growing stronger, clearer, and more distinct in its power. He was learning to speak through the silence of his work, preparing his soul for a storm of brilliant creativity that was just beginning to gather its strength inside him. He was no longer just a man who wandered the earth. He had become an artist of the truth, ready to find the light hidden deep within the shadows. One of the first truly significant and soul-stirring pieces that Vincent created during this formative Dutch period was a painting known as the Potato Eaters, a work that stood as a stark and unmoving reflection of his early artistic mission. In this dark and crowded composition, a peasant family sits huddled closely around a simple, rough-hewn wooden table beneath the flickering, uncertain glow of a single dim lamp hanging low from the ceiling. Their hands are depicted with an honest harshness, rough, calloused, and bony, the weary hands of people who have spent their entire lives digging into the very same earth they now eat from. You can almost hear the heavy, exhausted silence hanging in the room, and feel the deep weight of a long day's labor settling into their tired bones as they share their humble meal. Vincent did not intend for this painting to be charming or to decorate a wealthy person's parlor. It was a work meant to tell a difficult, unvarnished truth about the world of the forgotten. However, the professional art world of the time was not ready for such raw honesty. Critics and dealers quickly dismissed the painting as being too crude, too grim, and far too raw for the public eye. This cold rejection left Vincent feeling crushed and misunderstood. Yet he was far from being defeated in his spirit. He knew that he wasn't merely painting images for profit. He was painting the very weight of human empathy and survival. He once wrote in a heartfelt letter that his deepest desire was for people to look at his work and say, "He feels deeply, he feels tenderly." He wanted to touch the hearts of the laborers and the poor, the people who lived and died in the quiet shadows of the world. Throughout these difficult early years, he bounced between small towns and cramped, cold studios, living in constant poverty and rarely finding enough to eat for himself. His physical health began to decline rapidly, his body becoming fragile, thin, and worn. Yet, in a strange and beautiful paradox, the weaker his physical body became, the stronger and more resonant his artistic voice grew. He was learning to speak a language of texture, shadow, and silence. Though he remained completely unknown to the world, he was preparing himself for a total change of scenery that would soon alter his life and his palette forever. In the early spring of 1886, Vincent arrived in Paris, a city that pulsed with a frantic, electric energy and served as the beating heart of the global art world. His younger brother, Theo, who was now working as a successful and respected art dealer, welcomed him into his small, cramped apartment in the hilly district of Montmartre. The living space was often chaotic and filled with the sharp, lingering smell of fresh oil paint. But for Vincent, this move was the ultimate turning point for his artistic vision. The Paris art scene was electric and revolutionary, and it would forever change the way he perceived the relationship between light and shadow. It was here that he first encountered the radical ideas of Impressionism and its more meticulous, mathematical cousin, pointillism. Almost overnight, the muddy browns, heavy grays, and dark shadows that had dominated his Dutch period vanished from his canvas like a morning mist. In their place, his palette suddenly exploded into a riot of vibrant yellows, fiery reds, and electric blues. He began to trade his heavy earthy tones for colors that seemed to hold the warmth of the sun itself. The gray, oppressive skies of the Netherlands were replaced by canvases filled with swirling movement and a new, atmospheric mood. As he wandered through the city's cafes, he began to mingle with a new generation of fellow artists who were just as restless and experimental as he was. Among this group was a bold, proud, and deeply confident painter named Paul Gauguin. Vincent was immediately drawn to Gauguin's strength and clarity of vision, unaware that this new, intense friendship would one day shape his life and eventually lead to its most painful shattering. For now, however, the light of Paris was washing over him, and he was beginning to see the world not as a place of darkness, but as a landscape of infinite, glowing possibility. Even amidst the lively, colorful cafes and the bohemian streets of Paris, Vincent remained an eternal outsider, a man often described as socially awkward and emotionally intense. He struggled to connect with the fast-talking intellectuals and the carefree socialites of the city, longing not for parties or shallow praise, but for a deeper, more profound sense of understanding from those around him. He didn't just want to paint like the other artists. He wanted to feel the world differently, to see through the surface of things and find the raw, underlying emotion hidden beneath. To explore this inner landscape, he began painting dozens of self-portraits, capturing his own face again and again, as if searching for a truth that words could not express. In some of these works, he stares directly and defiantly at the viewer, while in others, he looks away as if lost in a private heavy thought. These portraits were never about vanity or ego. They were honest mirrors of his inner turmoil and the growing isolation he felt, even in the middle of a crowded, bustling city. Though his art was rapidly evolving into something magnificent, so was the weight of the emotional burden he carried every single day. The relentless noise of the city, the fast pace of Parisian life, and the heavy atmosphere of the art world eventually became too much for his sensitive spirit to bear. He grew tired, agitated, and desperate for a place of true peace and quiet solitude. He craved more light, more space, and the healing warmth of a sun that could soothe his restless mind. And so, in the early weeks of 1888, Vincent left the flickering lights of Paris behind and headed south toward the quiet town of Arles in Provence. He imagined this new place as a sanctuary, a new beginning where he could paint the wheat fields and the golden warmth he so desperately needed for his survival. He had no way of knowing that Arles would become the stage for his most iconic masterpieces, as well as the setting for his most painful and tragic unraveling. When Vincent finally arrived in the quiet, sun-drenched town of Arles in February 1888, the air was still biting with the cold, relentless mistral wind sweeping across the plains of Provence, but he did not mind the winter chill. He had come south with a heart full of hope, chasing the promise of a brilliant, unfiltered sunlight that he believed could heal his restless spirit. He imagined a landscape that would soon bloom with the most vibrant colors his eyes had ever seen: violet mountains against a deep turquoise horizon, endless yellow wheat fields, and skies of such a piercing blue they felt like a dream. He eventually found a small, modest house with bright, lemon-colored walls, a place that history would come to know as the famous Yellow House. He declared this humble building to be the beginning of a grand and beautiful dream, envisioning it as a shared sanctuary where like-minded painters could live, work, and inspire one another in a creative brotherhood. Having spent so much of his life in a state of profound and heavy solitude, Vincent felt a deep, aching need for human connection and a sense of belonging. In this new radiant environment, he began to paint with a frantic, manic energy that seemed to pour directly from the depths of his soul onto the canvas. He captured sunflowers in simple clay vases, their petals glowing like golden fire, and blossoming orchards that looked like clouds of white lace fallen to the earth. His brushwork became more confident, thick, and alive than it had ever been in the dark days of the North. He was no longer merely painting the world as his eyes perceived it, but as his heart felt it in the moment. The fierce, healing warmth of the sun was translated into a bold, thick yellow that pulsed on the canvas, while the stillness of a lonely bedroom became a rhythmic swirl of emotion, color, and line. Despite the flashes of joy he found in his work, a quiet sense of loneliness still lingered in the spaces between his brushstrokes. He wrote constant, long letters to his brother Theo, trying to explain the shifting moods of his mind and the electric colors of his imagination, always hoping that someone, somewhere, would truly understand the world that lived inside him. He waited with an ecstatic, trembling heart for the arrival of Paul Gauguin, truly believing that his vision of a shared artistic life was finally about to come true in the warmth of the southern sun. By the end of 1888, the bright and hopeful dream of the Yellow House began to fracture under a heavy weight of daily, painful conflict. What had started as a collaboration between two brilliant minds quickly descended into an unbearable atmosphere of tension, pride, and deep misunderstanding. Their personalities clashed with a violent intensity. Gauguin was proud, independent, and often dismissive, while Vincent was increasingly anxious, fragile, and deeply sensitive to every word. On the night of December 23rd, following a particularly bitter and heated argument, the fragile peace that Vincent had fought so hard to maintain finally shattered. In a state of utter distress and mental spiraling, he returned home and, in a desperate act of lost control, severed part of his own left ear. He was found the next morning in a state of collapse and rushed to the local hospital. While Gauguin left for Paris immediately, the two friends would never look upon one another's faces again, leaving Vincent in a landscape of silence once more. In the spring of 1889, seeking a sanctuary for his breaking mind, Vincent voluntarily committed himself to the Saint Paul de Mausolles asylum, a quiet, ancient stone building surrounded by gnarled olive trees and the scent of wild lavender. His small room had heavy bars on the windows, and his days were filled with a routine of rest and quiet meditation. But whenever the darkness lifted, he painted with a terrifying, obsessive focus. It was from behind those barred windows, staring out at the night sky of Provence, that he created his most iconic and enduring masterpiece, the Starry Night. This painting was never meant to be a realistic depiction of a landscape. It was a purely emotional pulse captured in oil. On the canvas, the great cypress tree rises like a dark flame. The stars burn with a fierce, swirling energy, and the sky pulses with an infinite motion that reflects the turmoil of his soul. Yet, in the middle of all that cosmic chaos, the quiet village below sleeps in a state of deep, undisturbed peace. Vincent himself saw the work as a failure, yet he had unknowingly captured the very feeling of falling apart while creating something luminous and eternal. He was a man slowly losing his grip on the world, yet finding the very essence of his soul on every canvas he touched. As we leave the swirling colors and quiet sorrows of Vincent's mind, the vibrant yellows begin to fade into a smoky blue, and we hear the first distant notes of a new rhythm rising from the crowded streets of a land far across the sea, from the long lingering silence of a painter's private studio, where the heavy air still holds the faint, earthy scent of linseed oil and slowly drying canvas. We begin to drift gently across the vast, dark sea toward the rhythmic pulse of a brand new era. This beautiful, complex music we call jazz did not find its vibrant voice in the polished, sterile halls of prestigious music schools or under the fleeting, bright lights of fame. Instead, it was born from the very raw textures of real life, from a profound and ancient well of pain, resilience, and the unexpected, golden sparks of joy found hidden in the deep, narrow cracks of human hardship. It emerged primarily from the heart of Black communities in the American South, a world where life was defined by both an immense daily struggle and an unyielding, powerful spirit. In these tight-knit neighborhoods, songs were never just simple entertainment. They became a vital, breathing way to pray, to remember, and to celebrate the quiet fact of existence despite the cold racism and exclusion that waited outside their doors. Every single rhythm was layered with something deeply sacred and human, a kind of musical alchemy that turned the heaviest sorrow into a form of quiet, moving grace. This profound transformation wasn't written down in formal textbooks. It happened in the warm intimacy of backyards and on dusty street corners where the soulful, echoing gospel met the raw, honest truth of the blues. Voices and drums carried a long history that mere words alone could never fully capture, telling stories of survival and hope through the language of sound. As the vibrant, swirling yellows of Vincent's painted fields fade into the distance of your mind, we find ourselves standing on the edge of a legendary city where the heavy air itself seems to hum with a restless, soulful energy. New Orleans, at the very dawn of the 20th century, was a unique city that breathed and pulsed with a constant music, a place where every significant moment of a human life had a specific sound at its very center. It was a landscape where the sharp boundaries between the sacred and the everyday seemed to dissolve in the thick, humid air of the Delta. Here, the arrival of births, the celebration of weddings, and even the heavy solemnity of funerals were marked by the persistent presence of brass bands that honored both the crushing weight of sorrow and the brilliance of a life well lived. A funeral procession might begin with the slow, mournful pulling of a somber hymn, matching the dark gravity of grief, only to suddenly erupt into joyful, triumphant brass music once the body had been laid to rest in the earth. This delicate, intentional balance between heartbreak and celebration became the very heartbeat of jazz itself. In these early days, the music didn't even possess a formal name. People simply played exactly what they felt in the moment, following their raw emotions more than any strict or rigid musical form. The music did not try to erase the cold presence of sorrow or deny the harsh reality of hardship. Instead, it invited sorrow to dance, transforming the heaviest, most difficult moments of the human experience into something extraordinary, beautiful, and alive. It was a testament to the powerful idea that even in the darkest, most excluded places, something luminous and enduring can always rise. New Orleans was far more than just a busy port city. It was a sacred meeting place, a living crossroad where a unique global blend of cultures, languages, and long histories collided every single day to create a sound that the world had never heard before. Inside the winding, narrow streets of the French Quarter, the elegant, refined sounds of opera and chamber music often drifted from the tall windows of salons, while just a few short blocks away, powerful African rhythms filled the open, sun-warmed air. New Orleans was a rare and noisy melting pot where French, Spanish, African, Creole, and Caribbean traditions did not remain separate, but instead crashed into one another in a beautiful, constant collision of shared sound. People of vastly different races and social classes regularly heard one another's music in the crowded markets and open squares, unconsciously borrowing phrases, haunting rhythms, and secret techniques. An old spiritual hymn might suddenly inspire a new melody, or a sharp, bright brass line from a parade could find its way into a late-night, smoky blues improvisation. In this divided and often segregated place, music became the one common language that successfully found its way around the high walls of racism and social exclusion. The city's very geography played a vital role in this evolution, as the tight-knit neighborhoods meant that the distant call of a cornet or the steady, rhythmic beat of a drum could easily reach from one block to the very next, drawing curious and hungry listeners together. A single, quiet performance on a weathered wooden porch could slowly grow into a full, vibrant jam session by nightfall, as neighbors joined in with whatever instruments they had. Out of this rich, noisy, and deeply soulful environment came something entirely new, a sound that wasn't strictly classical, folk, or blues, but was crafted with love from the broken pieces of all of them. It was a music that refused to be boxed in or labeled, a sound that welcomed individual freedom and the quiet beauty of the unpredictable. The deepest, most fundamental heartbeat of all jazz music came from the ancient soil of Africa, a steady rhythm carried through long generations of memory, loss, and survival. For many long years, even in the darkest and most painful chapters of human history, enslaved Africans, brought to the shores of America, held tightly to the sounds that reminded them of a home they could no longer see with their eyes. In New Orleans, these sacred sounds endured most famously in a place called Congo Square, a small patch of earth just outside the French Quarter. On Sundays, the only day they were allowed a brief, precious rest from their heavy labor, enslaved people gathered there to dance, play their drums, and share the deep traditions of their ancestors. What echoed through the square during those few hours was far more than mere entertainment. It was a profound act of cultural resistance and a reclaiming of human dignity through the power of rhythm. The hypnotic call and response chants and the complex polyrhythmic drumming were sacred ties to an identity that oppression could never fully break or steal away. Over time, these ancient powerful rhythms began to mix with European instruments like fiddles, brass horns, and accordions, creating a new music that was the child of many diverse sources. In this rich tradition, music was never seen as something separate from daily life. It was life itself, a force that told stories, marked the changing seasons, and healed the many wounds of the community. Each note carried the weight of a long history, and each beat served a deep human purpose. From this immense emotional depth came the power of improvisation, the absolute honesty of expressing a feeling exactly as it exists in the present, fleeting moment. These echoes of Africa gave jazz its enduring, immortal soul, providing a rhythm that moved the body and a pain that touched the heart forever. In the quiet, hazy years following the Civil War, the city of New Orleans found itself holding a strange and beautiful treasure, a vast collection of leftover military instruments. Brass horns, dented clarinets, weathered drums, and heavy tubas that had once been used to signal rigid commands across smoke-filled battlefields were suddenly no longer needed for the march of soldiers. These tools of war began to gather a soft layer of dust in the windows of local pawn shops, in cramped attics, and in quiet second-hand stores throughout the city. They waited there until they were found by the curious, working-class hands of ordinary people, the barbers, the butchers, the shoe shiners, and the porters who could never have afforded formal music lessons. These men and boys taught themselves to play not by reading sheet music, but by listening to the rhythm of the streets, and experimenting with the metal and air until the instruments began to speak, in a voice no one had ever heard before. The sound they created wasn't meant to be polite or proper. It was raw, loud, and filled with a personal soul that existed entirely outside the traditional rules of the conservatory. These self-taught musicians were busy inventing a brand new language, bending their notes and sliding between keys to tell the honest stories of their own lives. They successfully transformed these cold, mechanical tools of military order into warm, vibrant instruments of deep personal expression. Within this emerging sound, jazz did not punish mistakes or demand a perfect performance. Instead, it turned every missed note or unexpected squeal into a fresh opportunity for discovery, allowing the music to sway and shout with both joy and pain. In the sun-warmed streets of New Orleans, brass was no longer just a cold piece of metal, used for commands. It had become a vessel for magic and a means of total human transformation. Charles Buddy Bolden, born in the rhythmic heart of New Orleans in 1877, was the wild, flickering flame that lit the very first spark of what we now call jazz. By the late 1890s, Bolden was playing his cornet with a fierce, unmistakable intensity, creating a sound that was far louder, freer, and more deeply emotional than anything the city had ever encountered before. He was not a man interested in the rigid constraints of music theory or the cold ink of sheet music. Instead, he played entirely from instinct and the unvarnished rhythm of his own wild heart. He took fragmented bits of ragtime, the low, mournful moans of the blues, the spiritual energy of gospel, and the structure of brass band marches, stirring them together into a new sound that swung and shouted with pure soul. Crowds of people would follow his music through the neighborhoods, dancing on street corners until the sun began to rise over the river. He became known for a raw, unapologetic energy that perfectly captured the spirit of his hometown. Tragically, Buddy Bolden never recorded a single note of his music during his short, brilliant life, and yet his influence echoes profoundly in the very DNA of every improvised solo played today. His light burned fast, eventually leading to a quiet mental breakdown and a life spent in silence, but his legacy remained immortal. When he played, his horn seemed to laugh, cry, and confess, speaking a profound and human truth when ordinary words simply were not enough to reach the heart. He was a mystery and a myth, a man who created something eternal, with nothing but a cornet and a rhythm all his own. If Bolden provided the wild, untamed flame for this new music, it was Jelly Roll Morton who would soon step forward to give it its first enduring shape. Born Ferdinand Joseph Lamothe in 1890, the man who eventually called himself Jelly Roll Morton was bold enough to claim he was the true and only inventor of jazz. While that claim was grand, it was rooted in a very real and significant innovation of the time. Morton was a brilliant pianist, a composer, and a natural storyteller who spent his formative teenage years playing in the bars and gambling dens of New Orleans. In those dimly lit, smoke-filled spaces, he soaked up every musical influence the city had to offer, from the elegant Spanish melodies and the complex rhythms of ragtime to the deep, haunting sorrow of African American blues. He blended these diverse threads into a signature sound that was uniquely his own, bringing a sense of refinement and structure to the raw energy of the streets. Morton proved to the world that jazz could be both beautifully spontaneous and deeply structured. As he became the first person to write these intricate musical arrangements down on paper, he turned what were once chaotic jam sessions into carefully orchestrated experiences, crafting pieces filled with unexpected shifts and syncopation, while still leaving precious room for the surprise of a solo. He believed jazz was more than just sound. It was a feeling, a style, and an attitude that required a certain showman's flair. He provided jazz with its first real spine, a sense of order and sophisticated form, yet even within that structure, the music still knew exactly how to dance and breathe in time. While Morton gave the music its frame and its composition, the true, beating soul of jazz belonged to a young boy growing up in a rough neighborhood known as the battlefield. Louis Armstrong came into the world in 1901 amidst a landscape of deep poverty and hardship, but he found his magnificent voice in the most unlikely of places. After a childhood spent working odd jobs to help his family survive in one of New Orleans' roughest neighborhoods, a brush with the law on New Year's Eve sent him to a home for troubled boys. It was there that he was first introduced to the cornet, and from the very moment he held the instrument, his life and the history of music were changed forever. By the early 1920s, his sound had become unmistakable. It was warm, bold, and vibrantly full of a life that could not be suppressed. He eventually joined his idol, King Oliver, in Chicago, where his trumpet began to sing with a clarity and power that won hearts instantly across the nation. Armstrong didn't just blend in with the other musicians. He transformed the music by making his solo soar, turning each performance into a personal, intimate conversation with the entire world. He popularized the art of scat singing and successfully shifted jazz from a regional sound into a global voice that crossed all racial barriers. He made his trumpet laugh, weep, and dream, showing everyone that jazz was not just music, but a deep, shared feeling. Beyond the notes he played, his wide, sincere, and mischievous smile became a universal symbol of the pure, unadulterated joy that jazz could bring to any soul. He showed the world that music was a story told from the heart, and it was a story that could touch every person, regardless of their generation or background. In the streets of New Orleans, jazz was never allowed to become a dusty museum piece. It remained a living, breathing, and communal part of everyday life. The music was woven into the fabric of the community, from neighborhood parades and birthday parties to street performances and the famous jazz funerals. These funerals were not quiet or solemn affairs. They were emotional journeys that moved deliberately from deep sorrow to vibrant celebration. A jazz funeral would begin with slow, mournful hymns in minor keys that matched the heavy weight of a family's grief. But once the body was laid to rest, the music would transform. The tempo would rise, the horns would begin to dance, and the community would form a second line of followers who turned mourning into movement. This unique ability to honor the harsh reality of pain while still embracing the necessity of joy became the very heart and soul of the city's identity. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was a living thread that tied each new generation to the ones that came before, with children watching their uncles and neighbors play on porches and street corners. Jazz in New Orleans is a voice that has never stopped singing, a testament to survival that is dressed in the beautiful, rhythmic clothes of swing. It is a music that says we can make beauty from whatever we are given, no matter how difficult the circumstances. But as the sun sets quietly on the vibrant streets of New Orleans, the day begins to break over a calm and distant harbor nestled along the southern coast of the Pacific. The morning of December 7th, 1941, began with an exceptionally gentle sun rising slowly and quietly over the lush island of Oahu. Hawaii dot. As the very first light of dawn touched the southern coast, the sprawling naval base at Pearl Harbor was bathed in a warm, golden glow that seemed to promise a day of absolute, undisturbed tranquility. Tall, graceful palm trees swayed rhythmically in the light tropical breeze, their long shadows stretching across the quiet docks, and white seagulls floated effortlessly over the calm, warm waters of the Pacific. The massive, dark ships of the fleet rested quietly at their anchors, their great steel hulls gleaming softly in the early light as the sweet scent of salt air drifted slowly across the polished decks. For the thousands of young men stationed there, it was a Sunday like any other, a precious, slow-moving day of rest and familiar routine. Many took the rare opportunity to sleep in, feeling grateful for the slower, kinder pace of the weekend, while others sat quietly on deck with a warm cup of coffee, reading the morning paper or carefully writing long, heartfelt letters to their families back home. There was no visible tension in the air, and no immediate sense of threat to disrupt the perfect peace of the morning. Hawaii, for all its strategic importance to the Navy, felt like a distant paradise worlds away from the violent and heavy wars unfolding across Europe and the far reaches of Asia. The men moved through their morning with a deep, unshakable sense of security, truly believing they were in a sanctuary protected by the vastness of the ocean and the sheer strength of the fleet. Life at Pearl Harbor moved with a steady, comforting sense of order, a predictable hum of activity that suggested nothing out of the ordinary would ever happen. They were entirely unaware that just a few hundred miles away, a strike force was already airborne, flying low over the rhythmic waves to avoid detection. For a few final, precious minutes, the harbor remained a landscape of perfect, undisturbed stillness, held in a moment of time that would never return. Aboard the massive sleeping battleships lined up in the harbor, sailors performed their usual low-key morning duties. Some were busy scrubbing the long wooden decks, the rhythmic sound of their brushes blending softly with the gentle, repetitive lapping of the water against the steel hulls. In the mess halls below, A simple breakfast was being served, and the comforting smell of fresh coffee and hot food filled the warm air as men talked and laughed quietly in the low morning light. Officers checked their daily rosters, mechanics performed routine inspections of equipment, and quiet church services were being carefully prepared on several of the great vessels. On the nearby airfields like Hickam and Wheeler, long, orderly rows of aircraft sat wing to wing on the sunny runways, their bright metal wings exposed and unguarded under the rising sun. Not a single person in the entire harbor or on the green shore expected any trouble during those early, quiet hours. The base felt completely normal and secure, a fortress of steel that was thought to be nearly invincible in the middle of the vast Pacific. For the lucky few who had been granted Sunday leave, it was a morning to look forward to the soft sand of the beach, or a quiet trip into the city of Honolulu. It was a peaceful moment defined by the simple, everyday routines of naval life, the very last such moment that many of these brave men would ever know. The massive vessels like the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the West Virginia were alive with the quiet, domestic activity of a crew at rest, yet they were completely unaware of the sudden and violent transformation that was about to occur. Everything was calm, everything was in its proper place, and the morning moved forward with a gentle, rhythmic hum of life. But at exactly 7:48 a.m., that peaceful rhythm was broken, and the blue sky over the harbor changed forever. Without any warning at all, the sky over Pearl Harbor erupted into a scene of sudden, terrifying, and surreal chaos as the first wave of 183 aircraft swept in from the north. The quiet, sleepy Sunday morning was instantly shattered by the deafening roar of low-flying engines and the sharp, staccato sound of machine gun fire echoing off the water. Fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes filled the horizon in tight, dark formations, diving toward the harbor with a deadly precision that targeted the very heart of the fleet. Sailors aboard the ships scrambled to their action stations, many of them running barefoot or shirtless as they pulled on their heavy uniforms in the utter confusion of the moment. There was no time to think, only time to react as bombs began to explode on the wooden decks, and torpedoes tore through the thick steel hulls of the battleships. In just 90 brief minutes, the long-held illusion of absolute safety in this Pacific paradise was completely shattered by a storm of fire and steel. On the ground, massive hangars burst into flames and barracks were torn apart as the airfields became targets for relentless strafing runs. Men grabbed whatever weapons they could find, firing rifles desperately into the sky in an attempt to fight back against the overwhelming assault. Thick, choking black smoke began to rise from the burning ships, curling slowly into the air and covering the surface of the harbor in a heavy, dark shroud. Even amidst the terror and the vast destruction, there was a terrible, surreal beauty to the sight of the dark smoke rising against the brilliant, perfect blue of the Hawaiian sky. The sounds of loud alarms and shouting filled the morning air, replacing the quiet Sunday hum with the terrifying noise of a battlefield. Total surprise had been achieved, and the peaceful world that had existed just an hour before had vanished in a storm of fire. The heart of American naval power now sat broken and smoldering in the quiet, oil-stained waters of the harbor. The USS Arizona, one of the most majestic and imposing ships in the entire harbor, was among the first to be struck by a direct and devastating hit. A massive bomb pierced her forward deck and detonated an ammunition magazine, causing a catastrophic explosion that lifted the great ship nearly out of the water. In an instant, a column of fire shot high into the sky, and the Arizona began to sink rapidly into the mud, taking more than 1,000 brave men down with her into the dark. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma was struck by multiple torpedoes in quick, violent succession, capsizing in under 15 minutes and rolling over until her gray hull was exposed to the air. Hundreds of sailors were trapped inside in total, suffocating darkness as the water began to rise, their desperate rhythmic banging on the steel hull echoing across the surface of the water. In total, 21 ships were either damaged or destroyed in the attack, including the pride of the Pacific Fleet's battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The harbor, which had been a place of quiet routine and safety, was transformed into a floating graveyard of twisted steel and burning wreckage. Even after the planes had gone and the sky grew quiet, the destruction continued to smolder, and massive fires burned late into the night, casting a flickering orange light over the ruins. Thick, heavy oil leaked from the sunken vessels, creating a dark slick that would stain the harbor for many days and weeks to come. This oil, which still seeps slowly from the rusted hull of the Arizona today, serves as a solemn, rhythmic reminder of the many lives that were lost in those brief, violent minutes. The harbor was no longer a place of strength, but a place of profound loss, where the weight of history was written in the cold wreckage of ships and the lingering smell of burning oil. The quiet waters now held the stories of those who had served, forever changed by a single Sunday morning that the world would never be allowed to forget. On that catastrophic morning, the staggering scale of loss began to reveal itself in the quiet, heavy aftermath of the flames. Over 2,400 Americans lost their lives in those brief, violent hours, many of them young men barely out of high school, who had traveled far from their small, quiet inland towns to see the great expanse of the Pacific for the very first time. Yet, amidst the thick smoke and the terror, acts of breathtaking bravery began to emerge from the chaos like small, flickering lights in the dark. There were stories of sailors who, without a single second of hesitation, dove into the burning, oil-slicked waters of the harbor, risking everything to pull their struggling comrades toward the safety of the shore. These were not men who considered themselves heroes. They were simply friends and brothers who refused to leave anyone behind in the fire. In the moments where hope seemed entirely lost, their unwavering courage provided a sacred tether to humanity. On the land, the heroism was just as profound, though perhaps more quiet and exhausting, as the base hospitals were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of the wounded. Makeshift medical stations appeared in every available space. In cramped mess halls and private homes, medical teams and civilian volunteers used simple, wooden kitchen tables as desperate operating surfaces, working for hours on end without a single moment of rest. They operated under the dim, flickering light of lanterns or flashlights, their hands remaining steady despite the utter exhaustion and the distant thud of secondary explosion. When the medical supplies ran low, they offered what they had left: their presence, their steady touch, and their whispered words of comfort to those who were frightened. Those who survived that day carried the heavy, vivid memories of that morning silently within them for the rest of their long lives, rarely speaking of their own bravery, but always remembering the faces of those they could not save. The attack had been meticulously planned to destroy American naval power and break the spirit of the people. But in its dark wake, it stirred something much deeper, a quiet and unbreakable resilience that was only just beginning to find its true voice. The day after the attack, a strange and heavy silence fell over the entire North American continent, as a wounded nation gathered together in a way it never had before. In quiet farmhouse kitchens, in crowded city schools, and on cold street corners, Millions of people huddled closely around their wooden radios, listening through the soft crackle of long-distance static. They were waiting for a single voice to tell them what would happen next, their shared breath held in a state of suspended anxiety. At noon, they heard the steady, somber voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt as he addressed a joint session of Congress. He famously declared that December 7th, 1941, was a date which will live in infamy, his words echoing into every living room across the land. The speech was short, deliberate, and carried the weight of a profound historical shift, marking the end of one era and the sudden, violent beginning of another. In those few minutes of broadcasting, the long-standing and bitter debate between isolation and action was instantly over. The nation had found a new, unified purpose that transcended every political and social divide. The uncertainty of the previous years vanished, replaced by a grim and shared determination to face the coming storm together. His speech gave a clear sense of direction to a shocked and wounded people, turning their collective sorrow into a powerful, quiet call for national resilience. Men who had never left their counties began to stand in long lines at recruitment stations, while women prepared to take over the factories and shipyards that would soon become the arsenal of democracy. America had been awakened in a way that was both tragic and transformative, and history was already being rewritten from the cooling ashes of the harbor. As the echo of the president's voice faded from the airwaves, the country began the slow, monumental task of turning its grief into a force that would eventually change the world. Today, Pearl Harbor has returned to being a place of profound, calm silence, a sanctuary of water and sky, where the memory of that Sunday morning is carefully and lovingly preserved. The USS Arizona Memorial, a graceful white structure that seems to float on the water, spans across the rusted, sunken hull of the great battleship, marking the final resting place where over 900 sailors still remain. Visitors from all over the world stand on the white deck in a state of deep, reverent silence, looking down into the turquoise depths where the remains of the ship are still visible just beneath the surface. It is a place where time seems to stand still, and the busy noise of the modern world feels incredibly distant and unimportant. As you watch the water, you might notice something small and dark rising slowly from the rusted steel below. Small drops of oil still leak from the Arizona's fuel tanks, rising one by one to the surface and creating shimmering, colorful patterns on the water. These are often called the black tears of the Arizona, serving as a constant, solemn reminder of the sacrifice made so many decades ago. They are a rhythmic, living connection to the past, a silent pulse from a ship that refuses to be forgotten. Visitors stand in silence, watching as history quietly breathes beneath the gentle, rhythmic waves, feeling a sense of peace that can only come from true remembrance. It is a place to reflect on the fragility of life and the enduring strength of the human spirit. But as we leave the hallowed shores of the Pacific and the stories of the 20th century, we begin to look much further back in time beyond the reach of steel and engines, to the very first people who looked up and watched the stars. The salt air of Hawaii begins to fade, replaced by the dry, ancient scent of the desert, as we travel toward a land where time was first measured by the movement of the heavens. Before we begin our final journey together, traveling across the vast expanse of time toward the ancient golden sands of Mesopotamia, I want you to take a long, deep, and purposeful breath. Inhale the stillness of the room, and as you exhale, feel the last lingering tension of the day simply dissolve into the air around you. Take another breath, even slower this time, and notice the heavy, comforting weight of your body pressing against your bed. You are completely safe here, held in a space that is entirely undisturbed by the demands of the outside world. The stories we have shared tonight, the vibrant colors of Vincent, the soulful rhythms of New Orleans, and the quiet reverence of the Pacific are now beginning to transform. They are no longer sharp images or complex narratives. They are becoming soft, distant whispers, gently guiding your mind toward an even deeper and more profound state of rest. You are perfectly safe in this present, flickering moment, surrounded by the warm, protective embrace of the quiet night. There is nothing left for you to do, nowhere else you need to be. The world is asleep, and you are allowed to join it. Now let us turn our eyes upward, leaving the earth behind for a while, as we look up together at the ancient eternal sky. Long before the invention of glass lenses or the sophisticated reach of modern telescopes, the people of ancient Babylon watched the heavens with a sense of pure, unadulterated wonder. To them, the night sky was not a cold, empty vacuum, but a living, breathing tapestry of light that held the secrets of the universe. To get closer to these celestial mysteries, they built massive, stair-step towers known as ziggurats, which rose hundreds of feet into the warm desert air like man-made mountains of sun-dried brick. These were not merely religious temples or monuments of power. They were the world's very first observatories, meticulously designed to bridge the physical gap between the dusty earth and the infinite sky. Each level of the ziggurat brought the observer higher, away from the heat and the muffled noise of the city streets below, and into a realm of absolute clarity. High atop these towering structures, where the air was cool and the wind whispered through the crenellations, the ancient priests found a perfect, silent sanctuary. Here, in the profound stillness of the midnight hours, they would spend their lives patiently scanning the horizons, tracking the slow rhythmic movement of every wandering star. Every single brick of the ziggurat supported a worldview where the sky was not random, but a sacred encoded message waiting to be read. As you imagine standing atop such a tower, feel the vastness of the space around you and the smallness of all earthly concerns. The stone beneath your feet is solid, and the stars above are constant, guiding you into a deep and effortless peace. Ancient Babylon was nestled in the lush, fertile cradle between two of history's greatest rivers, the mighty Tigris and the winding Euphrates. It was a land defined by its wide emerald fields and a horizon so vast and open that the stars seemed to stretch on into infinity in every direction. In a world without the glow of electricity or the interference of artificial light, the night sky was a breathtaking, daily spectacle, a brilliant display where every single phase of the moon was visible and sharp against the velvet blackness. To the Babylonians, the sky felt intimately present, hanging over their daily lives like a great, protective dome filled with 1,000 stories and omens. They watched as the constellations shifted with the seasons, signaling when to plant their crops and when the rivers would begin their annual rise. The sky was their clock, their calendar, and their ultimate guide. As the sun dipped below the flat horizon, the heat of the day would give way to a soft, cooling breeze that smelled of damp earth and river reeds. The waters of the Euphrates flowed slowly and silently nearby, their dark surface acting as a perfect mirror for the glittering heavens above. The rhythmic, steady movement of the water seemed to match the slow, circular rotation of the stars, creating a sense of total harmony between the heavens and the earth. You can almost hear the soft lap of the river against the mud banks as you drift further away from the waking world. The entire landscape is at rest, held in the balance of the water and the light. For the Babylonians, stargazing was far more than a casual hobby. It was a sacred, heavy responsibility carried out with absolute precision by a specialized group known as the astral priests. These men were the keepers of time, highly educated in the complexities of mathematics and the delicate art of writing. Night after night, for century after century, they climbed their towers to witness the cosmic dawn, logging their detailed findings onto small wet clay tablets using a sharpened reed stylus. They wrote in cuneiform, a script of wedges and lines that captured the exact positions of the planets and the timing of every lunar eclipse. They did this because they held a profound belief that the stars were not moving at random. They were an ordered, mathematical reflection of a divine will. To understand the stars was to understand the very fabric of reality itself. In the quiet, heavy stillness of the deep night, these priests studied the sky with a sense of deep, meditative devotion, their breathing slowing to match the pace of the planets. They were the world's first true interpreters of the cosmos, the pioneers who turned wonder into data and myth into science. As you think of their patient work, feel the steady, rhythmic nature of their observations. The same stars they watched are the stars that watch over you now. Their dedication created a bridge of knowledge that has lasted for thousands of years, a testament to the human desire to find order in the dark. The ink of history may fade, but the patterns they found in the stars remain as constant as your own steady breath. The Babylonians were among the first to recognize the intricate choreography of the heavens, dedicating centuries to tracking the mysterious dance of the wandering planets. They were particularly fascinated by the planet we now call Venus, the brilliant morning and evening star that they associated with the goddess Ishtar. With a level of patience that is almost impossible to imagine today, they recorded every appearance and disappearance of this bright light, noting exactly where it rose and set against the backdrop of the fixed constellations. Even without the aid of modern glass lenses or digital calculations, these ancient observers discovered a profound secret, a perfect cycle of 584 days. This was the exact amount of time it took for Venus to return to the same relative position in the sky as seen from the Earth. What might have looked like random, wandering movement to a casual observer was, to them, a slow and incredibly beautiful divine rhythm. They realized that the universe followed a hidden set of rules, a mathematical harmony that governed even the brightest lights in the firmament. They watched the sky with such consistency that the once unpredictable movements of the planets finally became expected and understood. This discovery brought a sense of deep comfort and security to their world, proving that even the most distant parts of the universe were part of a grand, orderly design. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine this slow celestial loop, a planet moving gracefully through the dark, always returning to where it began. The universe is in motion, yet it is perfectly in balance, and you are a part of that same gentle rhythm. To most ancient cultures, a sudden lunar eclipse was a terrifying and chaotic mystery, a moment where the light of the moon was swallowed by an unknown darkness. But for the astronomers of Babylon, these events were not cause for fear. They were foreseeable milestones in a much larger story. By comparing their clay records over hundreds of years, they discovered a hidden pattern they called the Saros cycle, a repetition of eclipses that occurred every 18 years and 11 days. This was an incredible achievement of human observation, allowing them to predict cosmic events with stunning accuracy without a single modern tool or computer. It was a profound testament to their incredible patience and their ability to think across generations, passing knowledge from teacher to student like a sacred flame. They successfully turned a primal fear of the dark into a sophisticated foresight, understanding that the shadows moving across the moon were simply part of a predictable, rhythmic cycle. They learned to trust the darkness, knowing exactly when the light would return. Their data did not vanish into the air. It lived on, etched permanently into the very earth of the clay tablets they left behind. These tablets served as a memory for the human race, ensuring that the wisdom of one age would protect and guide the next. As you rest tonight, you can share in that same sense of foresight and calm. The shadows of the day are passing, and the cycle of rest has begun. You can let go of the need to watch or wait, knowing that the rhythm of the universe is steady, and the light will always return in its own time. Deep beneath the shifting, golden sands of modern-day Iraq, archaeologists have uncovered thousands upon thousands of small, sun-hardened clay tablets buried for millennia. These ancient fragments are not just filled with poetry or legal codes. Many of them are dense with astronomical data, the silent physical result of thousands of nights of patient observation. These tablets tell a story of a people who were obsessed with the permanence of the stars and the fleeting nature of human life. They recorded the positions of Jupiter, the cycles of the moon, and the rising of Sirius with a precision that still astounds modern scientists today. Long after the great walls of Babylon crumbled and its hanging gardens faded into myth, these humble records endured, waiting in the silence of the earth to speak of the stars once more. In these clay tablets, the ancient skies are still alive, frozen in time exactly as they appeared to a priest standing on a ziggurat 3,000 years ago. They remind us that our curiosity about the universe is an ancient and holy thread that connects us to the very beginning of civilization. The Babylonians left us more than just numbers. They left us a bridge between the heavy heavens and the quiet earth, a way to feel at home in the vastness of space. As your mind begins to wander into the landscape of dreams, feel the enduring nature of these stories. They are as solid as the clay and as eternal as the light from a distant star. You are resting on the foundation of all those who came before you, part of a long lineage of watchers who found peace in the deep dark sky. The magnificent legacy of Babylon does not just exist in museums or history books. It lives on in every clock we check, every angle we measure, and every star we name in the night sky. Their ancient spirit remains present in every curious child who looks up and asks why the moon changes its shape, and in every scientist who still believes that there is more to discover in the dark. They showed us, once and for all, that the sky is not an unreachable or frightening void. It is a place for wonder, a place for discovery, and a place to find our own sense of scale. They taught us that by watching the world with patience and love, we can find a rhythm that sustains us. As the stars continue their silent, ancient dance above your home tonight, you can rest in total confidence, knowing that the story of the universe is continuous, and that it will begin again tomorrow. The same heavens that watched over the ziggurats now watch over you, offering a canopy of light that never truly goes out. The darkness is not an end, but a preparation for a new beginning. Sleep now, as the ancient heavens hold you in their gaze. You have traveled far tonight, through colors, rhythms, and time, and now you have arrived at the final destination. The promise of tomorrow is already written in the stars, waiting for you to wake. But for now, there is only the peace of the night, the vibrant, swirling colors of Vincent's canvas, the soulful, echoing rhythms of the New Orleans streets, and the ancient, glittering stars of Babylon all begin to fade now into a single, soft, and velvet quiet. The stories have served their purpose, and the journey is complete. There is only the deep, heavy silence of the night, and the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of your own breath. You are no longer a traveler. You are simply a part of this long, beautiful history of dreamers and watchers who have found their peace in the dark. Let the world drift away completely now, leaving behind the weight of names, dates, and memories. Everything is still. Everything is exactly as it should be. The air is cool, the bed is soft, and your mind is clear. You are surrounded by a profound and ancient peace that has no beginning and no end. You are safe. You are held. You are home. Good night.